The forest around her was silent, but the silence carried a weight heavier than any gunfire she had ever endured. Twigs snapped under her careful steps, but she moved with the precision of a predator, trained to be unseen, unheard. She had been abandoned, left to die behind enemy lines while her squad retreated in chaos, and the memory of that betrayal burned like fire in her chest. Her uniform was torn, smeared with dirt and blood, evidence of the brutal firefight that had left her on her own. Her body ached, each wound a reminder of the night she had been left for dead, but the pain was secondary to the pulse of determination that now drove her. Every instinct screamed survival, every thought focused on revenge. She could not afford hesitation. The terrain was unforgiving. Dense forests gave way to rocky hills, streams ran through hidden valleys, and every shadow seemed to move with malicious intent. Yet she had an advantage no one had anticipated: knowledge. She remembered every map, every reconnaissance report, every enemy briefing she had been forced to endure before the mission. She knew the patrol patterns, the locations of sentries, and even the habits of the commanding officers. In the past, she had followed orders, trusted her comrades, and believed in the chain of command. Now, that trust was gone, replaced by the sharp clarity of someone with nothing to lose. She had learned quickly that fear could be weaponized, and she intended to wield it with precision. The first hours were the hardest. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, and fatigue pulled at her eyelids, but she pressed on, crawling through underbrush and clambering over rocks with the quiet determination of someone who had stared death in the face and refused to blink. Each step was calculated, each pause measured. She listened to the forest, discerning the faintest sounds of movement, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a distant branch, the low hum of enemy radios. Every piece of information was stored in her mind like a weapon, ready to be deployed at the right moment. Her wounds throbbed with every heartbeat, but she forced herself to ignore them. Pain was temporary, failure was fatal. As she moved deeper into enemy territory, memories of her squad's retreat replayed vividly. She had been caught in an ambush, pinned down by fire that seemed to come from every direction. Her squad had vanished into the smoke and chaos, leaving her behind. Initially, despair had threatened to consume her. The thought of being hunted by an enemy who had no mercy gnawed at her resolve. But then a flicker of something stronger ignited within her, a promise that she would not only survive but return and make those responsible pay. She forced herself to stand, to move, and to think clearly. Survival was not enough. She needed to regain control, and control meant understanding the enemy as intimately as she understood herself. By midday, she found shelter near a rocky outcrop overlooking the enemy's forward base. From this vantage point, she could observe without being seen. Soldiers moved about lazily, their confidence a sharp contrast to the fear that had taken root in her heart moments earlier. But now that fear was gone. She studied their routines, noting which guards took their positions too lightly, which entrances were seldom monitored, and where the gaps in their defenses lay. Each observation was a building block in her mental blueprint for revenge. She wasn't thinking about anger, or rage, or vengeance in the abstract. She was thinking tactically, planning every move like a chess player several steps ahead. As dusk approached, she shifted closer to the camp under the cover of shadows. The air was heavy with the smell of smoke, oil, and careless confidence. She could see the enemy's complacency in their posture, in their chatter, and in the way they patrolled the perimeter. She had been underestimated, discarded as a casualty, but now that miscalculation would be their undoing. She allowed herself a brief, silent smile. Every hardship, every wound, every sleepless night had led to this moment. She had been abandoned, but she was not broken. In fact, she was becoming something far more dangerous, precise, lethal, and patient. The night was still young, and she had all the time she needed to turn betrayal into justice. Night had fallen, and the enemy camp was cloaked in darkness, lit only by the dim glow of fires and scattered lanterns. The soldiers moved with a false sense of security, their laughter and chatter carrying across the compound. She watched from a ridge, her body pressed against cold rock, eyes scanning every detail with surgical precision. Each flicker of movement, every shadow, was recorded in her mind. The hours of observation had paid off. She knew exactly where the vulnerabilities lay. Her breathing was slow, controlled, her pulse steady despite the adrenaline that coursed through her veins. Tonight, the hunters would become the hunted. She moved like a phantom, slipping silently through the underbrush and hugging the shadows cast by crumbling walls and stacks of supplies. Every step was deliberate, calculated to avoid detection. She avoided the patrolling guards and ducked under hanging wires, careful to leave no trace of her passage. Her hands, calloused from training in previous battles, worked quickly to disable surveillance devices she had memorized during the day. Each click of a disconnected camera, each severed wire, felt like a strike against the enemy's arrogance. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was dismantling their fortress from within, one piece at a time. Her first targets were the isolated patrols at the camp's perimeter. They had been careless, straying too far from the main group, and their routines had been predictable. She struck with silent efficiency, incapacitating them with swift movements honed over years of training. None of them saw her coming. None would even know what had happened until it was too late. She left them tied and unconscious, a warning to any who might underestimate her. Each patrol neutralized sent a ripple of fear that would spread through the camp once discovered. She knew that fear could be more effective than bullets. It made the enemy question every shadow, every sound, every decision they made. Her next step was to disrupt communications. The enemy relied on radios and signal devices to coordinate, and she knew that if she cut these lines, chaos would quickly follow. She moved to the communication hub, disabling antennas and smashing radios with precise, controlled strikes. Sparks flew as wires were severed, the small explosions muffled by the night. In minutes, the enemy's ability to call reinforcements was gone, leaving them isolated, vulnerable, and blind. She paused briefly to catch her breath, listening as the distant voices of soldiers began to carry a note of confusion. Her heart remained calm. She could feel the tension in the camp, a tension she had orchestrated with every careful step she had taken. She advanced closer to the heart of the camp, where the commanding officers had gathered in a makeshift tent. Through the thin fabric, she could see them laughing over maps, confident in their control. But she had already studied their movements, memorized every shift in guard rotation, every predictable pattern of behavior. With patience and precision, she struck again, taking out isolated officers silently before retreating into the shadows. Each successful action was a strategic victory, weakening the enemy without drawing attention to herself. The camp, once orderly and intimidating, was unraveling under her unseen hand. As the night deepened, the chaos she had sown began to spread. Soldiers stumbled over unconscious comrades, radios were silent, and the commanding officers were confused and disoriented. Panic replaced confidence, and orders went unheeded. She allowed herself a moment of satisfaction, watching as the enemy's pride crumbled. This was not mindless revenge. It was calculated justice, a message that betrayal would not go unpunished. She had been underestimated, left behind as expendable, but now she was proving that one determined individual could topple even the most confident enemy. By the time the first hint of dawn touched the horizon, the camp was in turmoil. Fires burned where equipment had been sabotaged, soldiers moved erratically, and the air was thick with fear. She retreated to a safe vantage point, observing the results of her efforts. Every carefully planned strike, every silent movement, every calculated act of sabotage had brought her closer to her ultimate goal. The enemy was fractured, demoralized, and unable to mount a coherent defense. And she was just getting started. The first light of dawn crept across the horizon, painting the sky in muted shades of gray and pale orange, but the enemy camp below was far from peaceful. Confusion ruled the compound. Soldiers moved in frantic patterns, shouting orders that went unanswered, stumbling over damaged equipment and unconscious comrades. She watched it all from her elevated position, her face unreadable, her mind focused. This was the moment she had been preparing for, the final act. The enemy was fractured now, their confidence shattered, their coordination gone. They were dangerous, but disorganized, and that was all the advantage she needed. She descended carefully, using the terrain to stay concealed as she moved toward the heart of the camp. Her muscles were tight with exhaustion, her wounds still burning, but adrenaline carried her forward. Pain had become a distant companion, something she acknowledged but refused to obey. Every step closer felt like reclaiming a piece of herself that had been left behind on the battlefield when she was abandoned. The air was thick with smoke and fear, and for the first time since the ambush, she felt completely in control. Inside the camp, the remaining command structure was collapsing. She could hear arguments between officers, voices raised in desperation as they tried to make sense of the chaos. Maps were spread across tables, now useless without communication or reliable intelligence. She slipped between structures, timing her movements with the noise of the camp, using their panic to mask her presence. One by one, key figures were neutralized, not recklessly, but decisively. She struck with precision, ensuring there would be no recovery, no chance for the enemy to regroup once she was gone. Each action felt deliberate, almost calm, as if she were executing a plan she had rehearsed 1,000 times in her mind. As the sun rose higher, she reached the final objective, the central command post. This was where the orders had come from, where her squad's fate had been decided, where she had been written off as expendable. She paused just long enough to steady her breathing, then moved in. The confrontation was brief and one-sided. The enemy leaders, shaken and exhausted, were no match for her resolve. When it was over, the silence that followed felt heavier than the gunfire that had preceded it. The command post stood disabled, stripped of its power, its authority reduced to nothing. She didn't linger. Victory, she knew, was not about standing over the fallen, it was about leaving before the enemy could react. Explosions echoed behind her as secondary systems failed, the final consequences of the sabotage she had set in motion earlier. Smoke billowed into the morning sky, a signal that the camp was finished, its threat neutralized. She moved swiftly but carefully, retracing a route she had already planned for escape. Every sense remained alert, but there was a strange calm in her chest now, a quiet certainty that the worst was over. When she finally reached the outskirts of the enemy territory, she stopped and looked back one last time. The camp was in ruins, its soldiers scattered, its power broken. There was no triumph in her expression, no smile of victory. What she felt was something deeper, closure. She had been abandoned, betrayed by circumstance and command, but she had survived. More than that, she had returned on her own terms, not as a victim, but as a force that could not be ignored. She disappeared into the landscape, leaving no trace of her path, no evidence of her presence beyond the devastation behind her. To the enemy, she would become a rumor, a ghost whispered about in fearful tones, a reminder that even one person, left for dead, could change the course of everything. And as she moved forward into the unknown, she carried with her not anger, not revenge, but the unshakable knowledge that she had reclaimed her power. The battlefield had tried to erase her. Instead, it had forged her into something unstoppable.